I don't remember ever learning about climate change. Because I lived my whole life in dry places, climate change was simply a part of my reality. When I was 9, a wildfire raged through the Southern California home I had just left, claiming 24 lives, 3,600 homes, and 750,000 acres, and another 14 fires would ravage the area over the next 2 months. Just 3 years later, my Nebraska town was nearly burned to the ground by a fire started when a dry lightning storm struck the prairie on a 108-degree day in July. If we had lost the town, I don't know what any of us would have done. We were all poor. Fast forward again to 2013. While I was visiting the Colorado town where I went to high school, the state saw its most destructive fire in history. Many people I knew lost their homes. I can't remember a year when there wasn't a fire someplace I lived or had lived. I felt as though drought and fire were following me. I still have nightmares sometimes that people I love die in wildfires. We knew that these fires, in their increasing frequency and destructiveness, were in part caused by climate change. Over the course of my life, the American West has gotten hotter and drier. Facing this crisis, my family and communities tried to do our part. As long as I can remember, I have been told to take shorter showers, turn off the lights, reduce, reuse, recycle, and I did, and I still do, but everything I learned growing up reinforced a sense of despair about my future. No matter what I did, I couldn't avoid being part of the problem. I was in various environmentalist clubs over the years that encouraged students to be more energy efficient and implemented programs to make computers turn themselves off at night. I faced a bizarre cognitive disconnect. I felt morally obligated to do my part, yet I also felt utterly hopeless that my actions could ever matter. These tiny actions, I understood, were drops in the ocean. And I wasn't alone in this feeling. There were many people who were deeply concerned about climate change but felt powerless to do anything about it. Thinking of climate change as a problem caused by me and my friends and family was paralyzing because there was really nothing we could do. We couldn't afford solar panels. We needed heat in the winter. My mom had to drive to work. Things got worse. It turned out that peak oil was a myth. Fossil fuel companies were willing to go to ever more dangerous lengths to extract fuel from tar sands, frack natural gas, and drill over 8,000 feet below the ocean's surface. Climate change was also happening faster than most people had predicted. It wasn't until a few years ago that I really understood climate change as an injustice. That it isn't a threat, but a reality that is already destroying millions of lives. Farming practices that have been used for thousands of years literally don't work anymore. Farmers in Uganda have stopped seasonal planting because the weather is too erratic. Instead, they just plant seeds throughout the year, wasting time and resources. Climate change affects all of us, but not equally. Those who have contributed the most to climate change will be insulated from its destruction by their wealth, while those who have contributed the least, especially in the global south, will suffer the most. At the same time, I learned that fossil fuel companies directly oppress local people in the places where they extract resources. The story that got the most attention was Nigeria. The people of the Niger Delta have protested for decades against the drilling operations of Shell and other oil companies. For over 50 years, locals have become poorer and lived shorter lives with more health problems, while fossil fuel companies and their shareholders have made hundreds of billions of dollars. The people living there have virtually no power over their land, their resources, or their livelihoods. Protests, nonviolent for decades, and eventually desperately violent, have been either ignored or brutally repressed by Nigeria's military or the Joint Task Force, which is essentially Shell's corporate military. Over the years, hundreds have been killed in this struggle. And I was turning down the thermostat, hence despair. But something has changed. The mainstream environmental movement now speaks in terms of justice. We have started organizing for change in our political systems instead of just campaigning to increase awareness or fighting for conservation. 350.org and partner organizations have built a global climate movement. In 2012, Bill McKibben wrote the famous Rolling Stone article that laid out the numbers and gave us a clear picture of what and who we are fighting. The numbers are these. We have to keep global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius to have even a hope of a viable future. To stay below that limit, a limit that is, by the way, already suicide for countries near the equator or low-lying nations, we cannot emit more than 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Combined, the top 200 fossil fuel companies have 5 times that amount in their reserves. That doesn't even account for unconventional energy sources or coal reserves, and these companies spend billions of dollars every year on exploration and development of new fossil fuel resources. Their business plan is to burn all of it. This past September, I was at the People's Climate March, joining 400,000 others to urge world leaders to take real action on climate justice. At one point, I got ahead of my group, and as I was waiting for them to catch up, I saw all these different groups pass by: doctors, musicians, Korean churches, beekeepers, anarchists, and finally, I saw the students. They held huge, beautiful banners and signs, and they were chanting, "We know who is to blame. We know who is to blame." It was the most hopeful moment of my entire life, not because I felt absolved of responsibility, but because I could actually see the way forward. My responsibility is enormous. It is a responsibility to fight to change the systems of power that are causing our destruction. And it is a responsibility shared with millions across the globe fighting for climate justice. For me, political action and activism have been the antidote to despair. Many people, however, still face that paralysis of self-blame. I'm campaigning for Williams to divest its endowment from fossil fuels, and people ask me all the time, how can I call upon my institution to take action when I use fossil fuels? Wouldn't that be hypocritical? I tell them a story, and there are 100 stories I could tell, but I really like this one. At the beginning of the 20th century, streetcars dominated public transportation in cities across America. The streetcars were among the most reliable and well-made transit vehicles of all time. In the 1930s and 40s, the oil and automobile industries gained control of most of them and systematically destroyed them, rendering cars the only available means of transportation. Consumers in these cities aren't choosing to drive cars. Greedy corporations chose for them decades ago. Taking responsibility for one's own carbon usage is important. It is part of living coherently and aligning our actions with our values in as many ways as we can. But let's not confuse that for having a real impact. Even if I reduce my carbon footprint to 0, we will still be facing catastrophic global climate crisis. Our current system is one of immense corporate influence on national and international climate policies. It is one of politicians who are unwilling to propose significant change for fear it will damage their careers. And it is one of very little public pressure demanding that politicians gather the courage to enact meaningful policies. Fossil fuel companies spend tens of millions of dollars sowing misinformation every year and hundreds of millions buying the silence of our politicians. For every dollar that the industry spends on campaign contributions and lobbying in DC, it gets back $59 in subsidies. Some people hesitate to blame fossil fuel companies because they do provide a service to society. However, they have also spent billions ensuring our dependency, meaning that they're actively working to shut down any efforts to provide the same services through less damaging means. No single consumer can fight this kind of power. But when different groups combine efforts, when churches, colleges, and towns speak together with clarity and conviction, we can make ourselves heard. We can fundamentally alter the political climate to one in which fossil fuel companies can no longer maintain their grip on our political economic system. As long as the CEO of ExxonMobil can walk through the halls of Congress with his head held high, we are not going to see the kinds of policy changes we need to have a viable future. A carbon tax, more government investment in renewable energy, an elimination of subsidies from fossil fuel companies. We're not going to see any of that. Divestment is about reshaping the political arena to one in which these kinds of changes are possible. As an institution, Williams College claims to value academic honesty. Yet we invest in companies that spend hundreds of millions of dollars sowing misinformation through bogus think tanks and marketing and lobbying campaigns. We claim that we are meant to have an impact of disproportionate good in the world, yet we invest in companies who cause disproportionate harm to low-income communities, communities of color, and poor countries. Williams is supposed to be preparing us for the brightest possible future, yet it invests in companies whose business plan is to destroy that future. What do we as students learn from these hypocrisies? We learn that we cannot hope to overcome the terrifying gap between our ideals and our reality. That is not the lesson we should be teaching. Now is the time to ask ourselves and our institutions, what do we stand for? What do we actually stand for? Our refusal to divest from fossil fuels is a choice to support systems of oppression and to write off low-lying countries and indigenous people in our own country. Colleges and churches are meant to be the leaders of civil society, and so it is uniquely our responsibility as an institution to step up and lead this movement and to engage in the most urgent issue of our time. Williams claims that we affect the world through our alumni and our faculty. But the world does not change only through the well-educated, well-connected elites of society. It changes through social movements like this one, movements made up of all kinds of people. This is happening. It's already global. It's already scaring fossil fuel companies. It's already starting to create change, and we are sitting it out. We can do better. We have to do better. Another world is possible. We just have to build it. Thank you.